If you're like me, you've probably spent hours deciding on maybe what movie to watch, only to end up rewatching the same movie you've watched 5 or 6 times before. And yeah, that's what decision making does to you. And it can feel overwhelming sometimes. But when it comes to real life decisions, the ones about relationships, careers, opportunities, or even choosing that next big move, suddenly it feels like the stakes are way too high. And that fear will become crippling. It'll start putting doubts in your head, like, what if I make the wrong choice? What if I end up regretting this choice? Or what if everything falls apart? So today, we're talking about decision making, why our brains struggle with it, what the research says about humans and how they make decisions, and of course, how to stop fear from sitting in the driver's seat of your life. Because, spoiler alert, not making a decision is also making a decision. And sometimes it's the one that keeps you stuck. So let's get into it. Welcome to the Main Lore podcast. Welcome to episode 31. I am your host, Laura. And let's start with what science says. Research in behavioral psychology shows that humans often fall into something called decision paralysis. And we've all been there where we just cannot make a decision. We have way too many options, or maybe there's too much uncertainty. So our brains end up keeping us stuck. It makes us freeze into decision paralysis. There's a study at Columbia University that found that when people are given way too many choices, it's actually less likely for them to make a decision at all. The more options doesn't necessarily mean more freedom. It ends up creating this overwhelming feeling where your brain is stuck in this loop where it's trying to decide what is the best decision out of these 40 different outcomes. What if I end up picking the worst one? So instead of choosing, you end up stalling, you end up thinking the worst. You start analyzing things. You may call, your 20 different friends to ask for your opinions. You may end up Googling for 3 hours, probably asking ChatGPT questions, right? And of course, they're always very positive. You're never wrong. You start making pros and cons lists that could potentially keep you again in this loop of figuring out what is right and what is wrong. And even then, you may still not choose. But the interesting part is that research in decision-making shows that most people overestimate the negative consequences of the wrong decision and underestimate the ability to adapt to that decision at all. In other words, you're probably far more capable of handling the outcome of that decision than the fear that is leading you there. So your brain is basically just keeping you in this paralysis because it's afraid of dealing with the outcome. But the outcome itself is probably not as bad as you think. So let me give you an example. Imagine these two friends. Let's call them Johnny and Sarah. They both want to open their own online business. And so Johnny decides that he wants to do all the research. He's a perfectionist, looking up branding, marketing, everything has to be perfect. So he spends the next 6 months deep into the research, understanding the product, understanding the market, all of that. On the contrary, Sarah doesn't have as much money to invest in much, right, in marketing, but she has a good idea. And instead, what she does is builds up a product. Maybe it's not perfect, but she launches it right away within the first 2-3 weeks. And with that, she starts learning about what the market actually looks like. She gets feedback right away in real time, and she evolves, right? She iterates over time on what it is that she needs to do in order for her business to grow. Johnny, on the other hand, is still doing the research. He's still not sure whether or not things will be perfect. So he goes back in and does more research, right? Does more planning, invests more money into his business without ever launching it. The problem there is that while Sarah is already making money, like she's still doing research, she's still doing the work, but she's already making, even if it's not much, she's still making some money to put back into her business. Johnny, on the other hand, he is stuck in this loop, right? Because he's afraid of failing. Remember, he's a perfectionist. So now the product that he was supposed to launch 6 months ago could be outdated. could be a stale product. Maybe now he needs to build with sustainable products because that's what people want now. And so that is the problem with keeping yourself stuck, stalling, and making decisions. Because even though Sarah didn't have as much money to invest, Johnny had a more impressive outline, right? A more impressive marketing strategy, whatever it is. Perfection and fear often disguise themselves as being careful, but sometimes they're just stalling progress. And the truth is that clarity comes after action, not before it. So Sarah already knows what to do. She's learned in real time what she needs for her product. But meanwhile, Johnny is stuck. It doesn't matter how perfect he thinks his product is or how successful he thinks it will be. He still doesn't know. Because in the end, he was afraid to try. He was afraid of the outcome. In most cases, fear is actually trying to help you. Your brain evolved to keep you safe from, think of thousands of years ago, right? Lions and cliffs. But unfortunately, your brain treats life decisions like those same survival threats. So starting a business, changing your career, opening your heart to someone, yeah, that's scary. And your brain will say, danger, danger, abort mission, this is not comfortable to me. But the growth doesn't happen in that comfort zone. It happens right outside of it. You have to allow yourself to be uncomfortable because that fear doesn't mean that something is wrong. It just means that you're stepping into a new version of yourself where you're going to grow, you're going to learn, and you may be surprised at how amazing it is on the other side. Now, let's talk about practical ways that you can move forward to avoid blocking your decision making. The first one is, instead of saying, is this the right choice for the rest of my life? Ask yourself, hey, is this the right thing for right now? Is this the right thing for the near future? And life decisions aren't necessarily prison sentences. Sometimes you could think about marriage. For example, you don't get into a marriage thinking, well, when I end up divorcing, right? You don't ever think about it that way. But it could happen, right? There's that still small percentage that it could happen to you. But think of them as trying something new and being positive about it working out. And if it doesn't, you can adjust later. But always go into it with a positive mindset. Number 2 is using a decision-making tool which was created by author Susie Welch. And what she says is to always ask yourself when you're making a decision, how am I going to feel about this decision in 10 minutes? What about 10 weeks, 10 months, 10 years? When you start to think of decisions in this way, your outlook of it is going to change dramatically because it will help you zoom out. You're not going to think about it from an emotional perspective, right? You're not going to panic, and you're going to look at the bigger picture instead. So many fears that feel huge today may look very differently depending on how far you zoom out. And the third is to listen to your intuition. Yeah, fear is loud. Fear is going to tell you, what if I fail? What if something goes wrong? What if? But in the end, that fear is really overshadowing your intuition. Your intuition is going to tell you, this feels right. This feels aligned, even when it's uncomfortable. Think of a decision that you've made where you knew for a fact that it was the right choice, but in the end, you were still afraid. You were still unsure, uncertain of it. But something within you still told you that it was the right decision. And fear is there to protect your comfort, to make sure that you're safe. But in the end, intuition is what's going to guide your growth. So if you're battling between your fear and your intuition, just remember, your intuition is going to tell you the right answer. And your fear is going to tell you how prepared you are for it. Learning to distinguish between fear and intuition is going to save you from so much. So make sure that you're paying attention. If you're telling yourself, let's say you need to move to a new city, this is what I feel is right for me. Okay, well, what is stopping me from that? And of course, that's when fear is going to start to tell you all the things that could go wrong. Well, what if I can't find a job there? Well, what if I can't afford to live there? All these things are going to start popping up in your head. And so prepare. That is the answer. Prepare. Give yourself enough time to make a plan and get it done. But at the same time, don't plan for too long, because in the end, you probably end up in the same place you're in right now for the next 5 months, 5 years, 10, 20. And in the end, you're going to realize that you didn't make a plan, you didn't move, you didn't do anything. And all you're going to be left with is regret. Here's something that people don't talk about enough. There usually isn't one perfect decision. Sometimes life will give you a multiple choice test with only one correct answer. But most decisions can create different paths. Not all decisions have a one answer choice. Most decisions create different paths, but not necessarily better or worse ones. And the magic ingredient that determines how those paths turn out is really you. It depends on the level of effort that you make, the level of adaptability, how positive and enthusiastic you are about that decision, how you approach it, the mindset that you decide to take on. If you think about two people making a decision, one could end up in a completely different outcome simply because they were happy, enthusiastic, optimistic about the outcome, no matter what it was, regardless of how things will turn out. Meanwhile, the other person could be uncertain, fearful, unsure, afraid. So sometimes the real question isn't necessarily making the perfect decision. It's, how am I going to show up after I make it? So instead of asking yourself, what if this decision goes wrong? You could turn it around and say, what if the decision leads me to something incredible? Fear loves worst case scenarios. We're always thinking of the worst possible outcome, but the possibility deserves just as much time, just as much consideration. And sometimes the best opportunities in life rarely arrive wrapped in a pretty bow. They're not always the certain answer. They're not always the obvious answer. They usually arrive looking like risk and, uncertainty and I don't know what this is going. But taking the leap is the first step. And remember, without risk, there is no reward. As long as you can adapt, as long as you can take yourself further, as long as you can learn, because one wrong decision could sometimes even lead you to the right one. In closing, decision making is less about predicting the future and more about trusting yourself to handle whatever happens next. You're not necessarily trying to build a life where every decision is perfect, because we're not perfect. None of us are. You're more building a life where you are brave enough to keep going, to keep moving. If I would have not made the decision to join the Navy when I was 18, and I would have just been afraid to do everything else after that, these are decisions that change your life. These are decisions that push you into the next level of your life, of who you are. They help you grow. They help you evolve. That's why you cannot let fear get the best of you. Because staying stuck out of fear, that's the only decision that guarantees that nothing changes. So if you gotta take the step, take it. If you gotta make a decision, make it. You gotta make the call, make the call. You wanna send a message, send a message. You wanna shut a door, shut it. Whatever decision you need to make it. If your intuition is telling you that's what you got to do it. And trust that the future you is smart enough, resilient enough, and creative enough to figure out the rest. All right, this is it for today. If this episode made you think about a decision that you've been sitting on, I challenge you to consider this as your sign. Life moves forward when you do. So I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, share the love, and thank you so much. I appreciate you. Until next time, take care.